The island was a forgotten speck in the vast blue expanse of the Pacific, a sliver of land slowly being reclaimed by the jungle and the sea. For Kenji Tanaka, it had become a prison of sand, solitude, and the ever-present corrosive salt air. His world had shrunk to the perimeter of this crumbling garrison, a collection of weathered wooden structures and sandbagged emplacements that seemed to sigh with exhaustion. The airstrip, a scar of packed coral and earth, was his only tether to the sky, to the man he used to be before the war ground his spirit into dust. Each day bled into the next with a monotonous rhythm of maintenance drills and dwindling rations. The once proud Mitsubishi Zero fighters sat under frayed camouflage nets, their rising sun insignias faded by the relentless sun. They were like caged birds, their wings clipped by a lack of fuel and spare parts. Kenji would often run a hand along the cool metal of his aircraft's fuselage, feeling the ghost of its former power, a stark contrast to the impotence that now defined their existence. Homesickness was a physical ache, a hollow feeling in his chest that the tropical heat could not warm. He would close his eyes and be transported to the crisp air of his family's orchard outside Kyoto, the scent of blooming cherry blossoms a world away from the cloying sweetness of rotting papaya and the metallic tang of fear. He thought of his mother's hands, his father's quiet strength, and the letters that had long since stopped coming. The Imperial Navy's propaganda spoke of glorious sacrifice, but here, at the ragged edge of the Empire, there was only the slow, inglorious wait for an end that everyone knew was coming. The war was lost. They were just waiting for the final, crushing wave to break over them. As the sun began its descent, bleeding orange and violet across the horizon, Kenji climbed into the cockpit for his evening patrol. The ritual was familiar, a dance of straps and switches performed by rote. The field engine coughed to life, a sound that once filled him with pride but now only echoed the base's general disrepair. He guided the Zero down the strip, the plane lurching over its uneven surface before lifting into the heavy, humid air. Alone in the vastness, the cockpit became a confessional. He scanned the empty skies, his eyes tracing the familiar routes where Allied bombers might appear, but his mind was elsewhere. He saw the faces of his lost comrades, boys who had shared his training and his dreams. Kaito, shot down over the Solomon Sea. Young Eito, who never returned from a dawn sortie. And Hiroshi, his closest friend, who had volunteered for a taco mission with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Their ghosts were more real to him than the instruments on his panel. This daily flight felt less like a defense of the Empire and more like a vigil, a futile circling over a grave that was yet to be dug. The war had taken everything from him, his youth, his friends, his future leaving. Only this solitary flight through the gathering dusk, a silent testament to a cause that had long since turned to ash. The moon was a polished silver coin against a velvet sky, its cold light painting the ocean in shades of mercury and ink. Kenji Zero carved a solitary path through the vast silence, the drone of its engine a familiar, monotonous hum that did little to soothe the unease coiling in his stomach. He scanned the heavens out of habit, his gaze sweeping across constellations he had come to know as well as the lines on his own hands. It was on one of these practiced arcs, high to the northeast, that his eyes snagged on an anomaly. A cluster of faint shimmering points of light, no brighter than distant stars, drifted where no stars should be moving. He blinked, attributing the vision to fatigue or the strain of peering through the scratched perspex of his canopy. Perhaps it was a trick of the atmosphere, a rare refraction, or even the ghostly bioluminescence of some deep sea creature mirrored on the underside of high clouds. He tried to fit the sight into a known category, to file it away as a curious but explainable phenomenon. Yet his pilot's instinct, honed by hundreds of hours in the air, prickled with a warning. Stars did not dance. The lights continued their slow, deliberate drift, moving in a formation that was unnervingly precise, yet utterly alien. They wove around one another in a silent, fluid ballet, their paths intersecting and diverging in patterns that defied the rigid logic of aeronautics. There was no roar of engines, no telltale exhaust trails staining the night. only this ethereal, silent procession. Kenji's grip tightened on the control stick, his knuckles bleaching white. He leaned forward, his breath fogging the glass slightly as he tried to resolve the shimmering points into something tangible. Then, as if responding to his concentrated focus, the lights began to change. They pulsed with a soft, internal radiance, their individual glow swelling and merging. The chaotic dance solidified, the points of light drawing together like iron filings to a magnet. Before his disbelieving eyes, they coalesced, their forms sharpening from abstract sparkles into distinct, impossible silhouettes. They resolved into the shapes of aircraft, their outlines shimmering with a faint pearlescent sheen. They were Zeros, unmistakably so, with their iconic sleek profiles and rounded wings, but they were crafted from moonlight and memory, their fuselages semi-transparent and glowing from within. A cold that had nothing to do with the altitude began to seep into the cockpit, a deep, visceral dread that started in his spine and radiated outwards, chilling his blood. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm that drowned out the engine's drone. This was no mirage, no trick of the light. The rational part of his mind scrambled for purchase, suggesting secret allied technology, some new form of radar-jamming phantom, but the sight before him felt older, more profound than any human weapon. It felt like a glimpse behind the curtain of the world, a vision of something that was and yet could not be. The ghostly squadron held its formation, a silent, shimmering armada flying a patrol through a sky that was not their own. And Kenji Tanaka, a pilot trained for combat, felt a fear more profound than any he had ever known in the heat of battle. The impossible sight burned into Kenji's retinas, a fleet of ghosts painted in cold fire against the night. His training, a deep-seated instinct forged in countless drills, screamed at him to report the contact. His hand, moving with a will of its own, reached for the radio transmitter. The cool, rubberized grip felt alien in his sweating palm. He keyed the microphone, his throat dry as pumice stone. "Base, this is Tanaka on patrol. I have a visual, unidentified aircraft." His own voice sounded thin and reedy, swallowed by the immense silence of the cockpit. Response was not the crisp, static-laced acknowledgement he expected. Instead, a wave of pure noise erupted from the speaker, a screaming, spectral wind that seemed to tear from a place beyond the atmosphere. It was a sound that had no place in the physical world, a hurricane of static that clawed at his ears. Beneath the roar, something else began to form. Whispers. They wove through the cacophony like serpents, faint and sibilant at first, then coalescing with a dreadful clarity. They were not random hisses, they were voices, layered and distorted, speaking in frantic, overlapping Japanese. His blood turned to ice. He strained to listen. His entire body rigid, every sense focused on the horrifying transmission. The whispers spoke of lost bearings, of fuel gauges reading empty, of mothers in home. And then, cutting through the ghostly chorus with the sharpness of a shattering blade, one voice emerged, clear and heartbreakingly familiar. It was Hiroshi, his friend's voice, not as. Kenji remembered it in life boisterous and full of laughter, but then strained and etched with a terror that transcended death. "Kenji, help me! It's so dark! I can't find my way back." The words struck him with physical force, knocking the air from his lungs. He saw Hiroshi's face in his mind, not the determined mask of the departing taco pilot, but the boy he had grown up with, now forever lost, and calling out from the void. The voice came again, a desperate plea woven into the fabric of the screaming static. "Don't leave me here, Kenji. Please." A violent tremor seized his hands, a convulsive shudder that rattled the control stick. The cockpit, once his sanctuary, now felt like a coffin, the ghostly whispers pressing in from all sides. This was not an external threat he could engage or evade. This was an invasion of his mind, a violation of memory itself. Was the strain of the war, the grief, the isolation finally fracturing his sanity? Was his mind unable to bear the weight of so much loss, now conjuring phantoms from the static to torment him? The rational explanation felt flimsy, a paper shield against the visceral reality of Hiroshi's voice. With a final gasping breath, his fingers fumbled for the comm switch, slamming it into the off position. The sudden, deafening silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. He was alone again, but the echo of his dead friend's plea lingered in the air, a stain on the silence, leaving him adrift in a sea of dread and the terrifying uncertainty of his own mind. The silence left by the radio's abrupt cutoff was a physical weight, pressing in on Kenji until his ears rang with the absence of sound. He flew on, the drone of his own engine a lonely, mundane counterpoint to the spectral horror he had just witnessed. His eyes remained fixed on the empty patch of sky where the shimmering lights had been, half expecting, half dreading their return. And then they did. This time, there was no slow coalescence. One moment the sky was a vast, empty canvas of stars. The next, it was filled. A full formation of Zero fighters materialized off his starboard wing, so close he could count them, so vivid he could trace the rivets on their ghostly fuselages. They were perfect in every detail, from the curve of their canopies to the shape of their propellers, yet they were crafted from moonlight and memory. Their entire forms glowed with a soft, ethereal luminescence, a pale, cold light that seemed to emanate from within the aircraft themselves, casting no reflection on the surrounding clouds. His breath hitched, his gaze darting to the lead aircraft's cockpit. It was empty. A yawning, dark void sat where a pilot should have been. He scanned the others, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Every single cockpit was a hollow shell. These were not piloted aircraft. They were flying tombs, spectral machines carrying the absence of their crews. They flew in a perfect diamond-shaped V, their alignment so precise it was unnatural, a synchrony that spoke of a single unified will. He watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the formation executed a maneuver. Without a sound, without the roar of engines or the whistle of wind, through wires, the entire squadron banked in flawless unison. They dove as one, a silent, glowing arrowhead plunging toward the ocean below, then pulled up in a graceful, impossible arc that defied physics. They wove through the air in a complex aerial ballet, their movements silent and seamless. There was no engine noise, no prop wash, no disturbance in the air at all. They moved through the sky like thoughts through a mind untethered from the physical world. An inexplicable pull tugged at Kenji, a compulsion that overrode his fear. He nudged his control stick, turning his Zero to follow the Phantom Squadron. For a few heartbeats, he flew parallel to them, a living man shadowing a procession of the dead. He could see the faint, swirling patterns within their glowing forms like mist trapped under glass. He felt a profound, chilling loneliness emanating from them, a sorrow as deep and cold as the ocean beneath. Then, as if acknowledging his presence for the first time, the lead aircraft tilted a wing. In a single fluid motion, the entire formation turned as one and flew directly into a thick bank of cloud. Kenji followed, pushing his plane into the damp gray mist. But when he emerged on the other side, the sky was empty. The ghosts were gone. No fading light, no dissipating glow, just the vast, indifferent night and the steady, mundane hum of his own engine. He was alone, utterly and completely, left with nothing but the chilling certainty of what he had seen and the bewildering silence that now felt heavier than any sound. The walk from the airstrip to the command hut felt longer than any flight Kenji had ever undertaken. Each step was a labor, his flight boots scuffing through the coarse coral sand as if the island itself were trying to hold him back. The ghostly silence of the Phantom Squadron still rang in his ears, a vacuum of sound more deafening than any explosion. He carried the weight of their ethereal presence with him. A cold dread nestled deep in his gut that the rising tropical sun could not burn away. He had to report it. Duty? That rigid backbone of his military existence demanded it, even as every instinct whispered that the truth would be a weapon turned against him. Captain Maury's office was a Spartan cell of corrugated iron and frayed maps, smelling of damp paper, stale tobacco, and the sharp metallic scent of anxiety. The captain himself was a man carved from the same weary stone as the island, his face a web of lines etched by sun and stress, his eyes two chips of flint that had long since forgotten how to show surprise. He did not look up from a logistics report as Kenji entered, the scratch of his pen a dry, dismissive sound. Kenji stood at rigid attention, the words he had, rehearsed during the walk, clotting in his throat. He finally forced them out. A halting, disjointed account of shimmering lights, silent formations, and empty cockpits. The scratching stopped. Captain Maury slowly placed his pen down, the deliberate motion more threatening than a shouted command. He finally lifted his gaze, and the flint in his eyes sparked with cold derision. He did not see a loyal pilot reporting a potential threat. He saw a frayed nerve, a crack in the Imperial facade. A short, humorless bark of laughter escaped his lips, a sound like gravel grinding underfoot. He scoffed, dismissing the entire account with a wave of his hand that seemed to bat the phantom zeros from the air. "Fatigue," he declared. "The strain of a lost war, the poor rations, the constant fear. It was conjuring phantoms in the minds of good men. Or worse, it was a clever allied deception, some newfangled radar ghost or propaganda trick designed to sap their already waning morale." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that filled the small room. He ordered Kenji to focus on the tangible material threats, the American bombers that would soon darken their skies, the warships that would appear on the horizon. He spoke of duty, of honor, of the need for unwavering resolve. Then came the warning, delivered with the finality of a judge passing a sentence. Kenji was not to speak of this to anyone, not a word to the mechanics, not a whisper to the other pilots. Spreading such superstitious nonsense was a contagion he would not tolerate. It was an order, absolute and unyielding. Dismissed, Kenji stumbled back out into the blinding sunlight. The captain's words were a door slammed shut on his experience, locking his truth away in a prison of official denial. He felt a profound isolation settle over him, colder and more desolate than the vastness of the night sky. His loyalty to his commander in the chain of command warred violently with the unshakable bone-deep certainty of what he had seen and heard. One demanded obedience and silence, the other screamed that a terrible supernatural truth was unfolding around them. Standing there on the crumbling base, caught between the stern reality of his captain and the haunting reality of the ghosts, Kenji Tanaka felt more alone than he ever had in the empty cockpit of his plane, a man stranded on an island of one, his fear's only confirmed companion. The dismissal from Captain Maury did not extinguish the fire of Kenji's conviction. It banked the coals, turning them into a slow, smoldering resolve that burned hotter in the silence. He would not be swayed by scorn or the threat of reprimand. The ghosts were real. Hiroshi's voice had been real. The empty, glowing cockpits had been real. And so, he began to volunteer for every available night patrol, trading precious hours of restless sleep for the vast dark theater of the sky. His fellow pilots, weary and hollow-eyed, were only too happy to relinquish the lonely, uneventful duties. They saw it as a strange, self-imposed penance. Kenji knew it was a hunt. The tropical night wrapped around his Zero like a black velvet cloak, the air cool and heavy with the scent of distant rain. The moon was a sliver tonight, offering little illumination, turning the ocean into a bottomless pit of ink. This was his element now, this realm of shadows and whispers. He flew with a new, sharp-edged awareness, his eyes no longer just scanning for the distant specks of Allied aircraft, but probing the deeper darkness between the stars, searching for that telltale shimmer, that silent, impossible glow. He was a fisherman casting his net into the void, patient and relentless. They appeared not as a gradual emergence, but as a sudden, breathtaking revelation. One moment, the sky was empty. The next, the Phantom Squadron was there, materializing off his port wing so close he could have counted the ghostly rivets on their nearest wing. They were clearer than ever before, their ethereal light casting a faint pearlescent sheen on his own cockpit canopy. The same perfect diamond formation, the same silent, empty fuselages glowing with that cold internal fire. But this time, something was different. This time, he felt them. It was not a sound or a sight, but a sensation, a subtle magnetic pull in the center of his chest, as if an invisible tether had been tied to his sternum. The ghostly formation began a slow, banking turn, not the aggressive acrobatic dive of before, but a deliberate, almost languid movement. And as they turned, the pull intensified, a gentle, insistent guidance. They were not just flying, they were leading. They were charting a course and they were inviting him to follow. A profound understanding washed over him, cold and certain. These were not random apparitions, they were signposts, pointing towards something hidden, a truth buried beneath the waves of war and denial. They were the echoes of his comrades, and they had a message they could not speak. He followed, his hand steady on the controls, his fear now tempered by a fierce, burgeoning purpose. He let the invisible cord guide him, his zero a faithful shadow to the spectral procession. They led him on a gentle arc away from the standard patrol route toward a desolate quadrant of ocean, where no shipping lanes ran and no islands broke the surface. For nearly an hour he flew in their silent wake, the formation holding its course with an unnerving precision. Then, as if their task was complete, they simply dissolved, fading from solid, glowing forms into shimmering motes of light which then winked out one by one, leaving him alone over the featureless black sea. Back in the dim light of his quarters, the base asleep around him, Kenji did not try to sleep. He opened his logbook, its pages filled with mundane flight data and fuel calculations. On a fresh blank page, he took up his pencil. His hand moved with a sure, steady grace, no longer trembling. He sketched the diamond formation, the angle of their bank, the specific heading they had led him toward. He drew the empty cockpits, the faint swirling patterns within the light. Each line he put to paper was an act of defiance, a testament to a truth that command refused to see. As he finished, shading the ghostly wings with the side of his pencil, his resolve hardened into something unbreakable. He was no longer just a witness. He was now a chronicler, and he would follow this mystery into the heart of the darkness itself, no matter the cost. The silence in the barracks was a heavy, living thing, broken only by the drone of insects outside and the faint, rhythmic breathing of sleeping men. Kenji lay on his cot, staring at the rough-hewn wooden beams of the ceiling. The phantom sketches in his logbook, feeling as though they were glowing in the dark, branding the truth into the humid air. He had just closed the book, the weight of his solitary knowledge a crushing burden, when a shadow fell across his bunk. He turned his head to see Sato, a fellow pilot whose cot was 2 down from his own. Sato was a quiet man, reliable and steady, with a face that usually held a calm, almost detached expression. Now, in the dim light of the single guttering oil lamp, his face was a mask of strained intensity, his eyes wide and haunted. Sato did not speak at first. He simply stood there, his hands clenched at his sides, his gaze fixed on Kenji with a desperate, searching look. Then, he gestured with a sharp, jerky movement of his head toward the doorway that led out to the rear of the barracks, away from the sleeping forms of their comrades. The message was clear. Kenji's heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm of anticipation. He rose, the cot creaking under his weight, and followed Sato out into the oppressive, moonless night. They stood in the lee of the building, the rough wood at their backs, the jungle a wall of impenetrable blackness before them. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and damp earth. For a long moment, Sato just stared at the ground, scuffing his boot in the dirt, gathering his courage. When he finally spoke, his voice was a hushed, raw whisper barely audible over the chorus of crickets. He confessed it all in a rushed, trembling torrent. He had seen them too, on his solo patrols in the dead hours of the night. The lights that were not stars, the silent, glowing formations that mirrored their own Zeros, He described the same cold dread, the same frantic search for a rational explanation that crumbled to dust in the face of the impossible. He admitted to the shameful tremors in his hands upon landing, the forced calm he had to project, the terror of thinking he was losing his mind. As he spoke, the formal barriers between them dissolved, replaced by a new, unspoken bond forged in shared terror. They were no longer just fellow soldiers. They were fellow witnesses, the sole inhabitants of a terrifying, secret world. Kenji listened, a profound sense of relief washing through him so powerfully it left him lightheaded. He was not alone. The validation was a balm on the raw wound of Captain Mori's dismissal. He began to share his own stories in the same hushed tones, the words tumbling out now that he had a receptive ear. He spoke of the first sighting, the coalescing shapes, the unnatural silence. He described the radio transmission, the screaming static, and the whispers. He did not mention Hiroshi's name, but the pain in his voice as he described the dead voice pleading for help was unmistakable. Sato nodded grimly. His own eyes shadowed with a similar grief. He leaned closer, his voice dropping even further, becoming a thread of sound. He revealed his own haunting. On his last encounter, as the ghostly formation passed mere meters from his wing, his cockpit had filled not with static, but with a chorus of familiar voices. They were the voices of his two elder brothers, both pilots. Pilots per 10, both lost early in the war over China. They were not pleading or screaming, he said, but speaking to each other in calm, matter-of-fact tones, discussing heading and fuel, as if on a routine training flight, utterly unaware they were dead. The mundane horror of it, the eternal looping moment of their final ordinary mission, had chilled him to the marrow in a way no specter of battle ever could. Standing there in the darkness, the two young men shared a look that conveyed more than words ever could. They were bound together now, not just by duty or the shared hardship of war, but by this deeper, more intimate connection to the dead. The ghosts were not just phantoms. They were their brothers, their friends, their comrades. And in the heavy, listening silence of the tropical night, that bond felt both like a sacred trust and an unbearable weight. A secret they would now have to carry together into whatever end awaited them. The distant thunder was not from the sky. It was a low, rhythmic booming that rolled across the water, a sound felt in the bones more than heard with the ears. The Allied fleet was drawing its noose tighter. The island, once a forgotten outpost, was now a target in the crosshairs of a vast and unstoppable war machine. The base, already frayed at the edges, snapped into a frantic, desperate energy. Supplies that had been hoarded for months were broken open. Ammunition was distributed with grim efficiency, and the remaining Zeros were serviced with a feverish intensity, their engines tuned for one last defiant snarl. The air itself thickened with the smell of fear, sweat, and the acrid scent of impending violence. Every man knew the storm was no longer coming. It had arrived. Kenji's patrols transformed from lonely vigils into perilous dashes through a contested sky. The empty horizons of weeks past were now dotted with the ominous specks of Allied reconnaissance planes, and the once clear radio channels buzzed with encrypted American traffic. He flew with his heart in his throat, his eyes constantly scanning, not just for the ethereal glow of his phantom companions, but for the deadly glint of American Hellcats. The sky, his former sanctuary, had become a hunting ground, and he was both the hunter and the hunted. Each mission felt like a gamble with death, the odds worsening with every passing day as the enemy's shadow fell longer across their tiny speck of land. And through it all, the ghosts became more frequent, their appearances no longer mysterious visitations, but urgent, recurring phenomena. They no longer waited for the deep silence of the night. Kenji saw them at dusk, their pale forms stark against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. He saw them at dawn, weaving through the morning mists that clung to the ocean's surface. Most chillingly, he began to notice a pattern. The Phantom Squadron would often appear mere minutes before an enemy engagement. A shimmering, silent V would materialize on the periphery of his vision, and shortly after, his radio would crackle with a warning from base, or his own eyes would pick out the distant dark shapes of an allied patrol. This recurring sequence plunged Kenji into a deep and turbulent inner conflict. Were these spectral flyers omens, their silent flights, a herald of the death and destruction that was moments away from descending upon them? Were they simply replaying their own final fatal moments, trapping him in their eternal tragic loop? Or were they something else, protectors, guardians of their lost homeland, using their unearthly presence to guide him, to warn him, to keep a lone living comrade from joining their ranks too soon? He remembered the pull, the gentle guidance away from the hidden patrol, and a fragile hope warred with his superstitious dread. The thought that Hiroshi and the others might be watching over him was a comfort so profound it felt like a betrayal of the harsh, material reality of war. Yet the pure alternative, that they were merely death's harbingers, was a despair too heavy to bear. As the real storm of war gathered to break over the island, Kenji's mind became its own battlefield, torn between the cold logic of command and the haunting, inexplicable loyalty of the dead. His inner turmoil a perfect mirror of the chaos about to engulf them all. The order came not as a surprise, but as a grim confirmation. They were throwing their last frayed threads of resistance against the advancing tide. Captain Mori's voice was stripped of all emotion, a flat, metallic command over the crackling field radio. A high-risk, long-range reconnaissance mission. Kenji was to fly deep into the quadrant now dominated by the American fleet, a lone sparrow sent into a sky full of hawks. The objective was to locate and report the composition of the enemy's main force, a suicide run disguised as a duty. As he strapped himself into the cockpit, the worn leather felt like a shroud. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life, its familiar sound now a funeral dirge. He lifted the Zero from the scarred airstrip, the crumbling base falling away beneath him, and turned its nose toward the vast, empty blue that was no longer empty. He flew for over an hour, the ocean an unbroken expanse of shimmering turquoise beneath him, its deceptive beauty a stark contrast to the tension coiling in his shoulders. His eyes ached from the constant, vigilant sweep of the horizon, searching for the telltale speck that would signal the end. Then he saw them. Far to the north, a cluster of dark, distant shapes against the water. Warships. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. He began his climb, seeking the thin veil of cloud cover, his mind already composing the terse, final transmission. But as he banked, a flicker of light caught his eye, not the sun on metal, but that familiar cold internal luminescence. The Phantom Squadron materialized off his starboard side, not as a distant formation, but as a close, urgent escort. They were clearer and more vivid than ever before, their empty cockpits like dark, accusing eyes. They did not fly their usual, serene patrol. They flew with a new, aggressive purpose. The lead aircraft tipped its wings sharply, then dove, the entire formation following in a silent, plunging arrowhead. The magnetic pull in Kenji's chest was no longer a gentle suggestion. It was a violent physical yank demanding he follow. Instinct screamed at him to ignore the phantoms, to complete his mission, to fly toward the enemy. But a deeper, more primal instinct, born of countless encounters and the memory of Hiroshi's voice, took control. His hands moved on the controls without conscious thought, his Zero banking hard, turning its back on the distant warships to chase the ghosts into the empty southeastern sky. He followed their silent, glowing trail for what felt like an eternity. His mind a riot of confusion and dread. He was abandoning his duty, his honor, everything he had been taught. Then, as the phantom formation leveled out, he glanced back over his shoulder toward the quadrant he had just left. His blood ran cold. There, emerging from a bank of low-lying cloud he had not even registered, was a flight of 4 American Grumman Hellcats. They had been lying in wait, a hidden patrol positioned perfectly to ambush any Japanese aircraft approaching the fleet. If he had continued on his original course for just another minute, he would have flown directly into their guns. The ghosts had not led him away from his mission. They had led him away from a trap. The Phantom Squadron began to fade, their forms dissolving into the bright afternoon light like mist under a hot sun. Within seconds, the sky was empty again, save for the distant, oblivious specks of the enemy patrol. Kenji turned his Zero toward home, his hands trembling not with fear but with a profound, soul-shaking revelation. He had not been saved by luck or skill. He had been saved by the dead. The spirits of his comrades had intervened, pulling him from the jaws of death. He landed on the battered airstrip, the mission a failure in the eyes of command, but in his heart a terrifying success. As he climbed from the cockpit, his legs weak beneath him, he was left to grapple with the staggering meaning of his survival. He was alive because the war was not yet over for the ghosts. Their duty, it seemed, was eternal, and he was now irrevocably a part of it. The news of the surrender arrived not with a bang, but with a stunned, suffocating silence. It seeped into the crumbling garrison on a static-laced radio broadcast from Imperial headquarters, a voice from another world speaking words that felt both impossible and inevitable. The divine wind had not come. The Empire had bowed. For Kenji Tanaka, standing in the dusty command hut amidst his hollow-eyed comrades, the proclamation did not bring relief, but a profound and disorienting void. The war, the day, constant, grinding fear that had defined his existence for years, was simply over. The purpose that had been drilled into him, the honor he was prepared to die for, evaporated into the humid air, leaving behind only the stark reality of their defeat and the ghostly weight of all that had been lost. The following days were a surreal pantomime of surrender. The remaining Zeros were taxied to the center of the airstrip, their propellers removed, their fuel drained, sitting like beached metal whales under the indifferent sun. Rifles were stacked in neat, useless pyramids. Kenji moved through the motions with the others, a numb automaton, his mind adrift in the silence that had replaced the ever-present dread of attack. He thought of the Phantom Squadron, of Hiroshi's pleading voice. Had their eternal patrol also ended? Or were they, like him, simply following orders from a command that no longer existed? When the American ships appeared on the horizon, they were not the monstrous, fire-breathing leviathans of propaganda, but sleek, gray vessels of immense and quiet power. Landing craft crawled toward the shore, disgorging soldiers who moved with a confident, weary efficiency. The capture was swift and antiseptic. There were no shots fired, no final glorious bonsai charge. The Japanese garrison, emaciated and clad in tattered uniforms, simply laid down their arms. Kenji stood in line, his head bowed not in shame, but in a bewildered exhaustion. An American Marine, young and with eyes as tired as his own, gestured for him to move forward. His hands were bound loosely in front of him, the rough texture of the rope a final humiliating confirmation of their new reality. Yet the anticipated brutality never came. The Americans offered canteens of clean water, strange tasting but nourishing rations, and basic medical care for the sick and wounded. The humanity in the gesture was more disarming than any threat. Kenji was processed with a detached professionalism, his name and rank recorded by a clerk who did not meet his eyes. He was just another number, another piece of the war's debris to be catalogued and cleared away. He felt a strange, hollow gratitude for this impersonal kindness, a stark contrast to the fiery rhetoric of an enemy that was supposed to be a demon. His final moments on the island came as he was herded with a group of other prisoners toward a waiting landing craft that would ferry them to a larger transport ship. The coarse coral sand crunched under his boots for the last time. As he waded into the warm, lapping water, he instinctively turned for one last look at the jungle-choked hills, the crumbling barracks, the skeletal remains of the airstrip. And there, high above the island's highest peak, he saw them. The Phantom Squadron hung in the late afternoon sky, their forms faint, shimmering like heat haze. They were not flying their complex maneuvers, but holding a perfect stationary formation, a silent, spectral honor guard, watching over the end of their war. For a fleeting moment, Kenji felt the familiar, cold pull in his chest. A final, gentle farewell. He saw the lead aircraft, its cockpit a dark void, and in his mind, he heard not a scream or a plea, but a simple, quiet sigh on the wind. It was a sound of release. Then, as the American sailor beside him gestured for him to climb aboard, the vision faded. The ghosts dissolved into the golden light of the setting sun, leaving behind an empty, peaceful sky. A complex wave of emotion washed over Kenji, a piercing grief for Hiroshi, for Sato, for all the boys who would never go home, mingled with a profound and unexpected sense of closure. Their patrol was over. His was, too. As the landing craft motored away from the shore, carrying him toward an uncertain future, he knew the ghosts were not gone. They were finally, truly, at rest. And in that knowledge, Kenji Tanaka, a prisoner of war, felt a salvation deeper than any victory could have offered. The Japan Kenji Tanaka returned to was a ghost of its former self, a nation of scorched earth and shattered spirits, its proud cities reduced to plains of ash and skeletal ruins. The journey home had been a slow, disorienting passage through a world he no longer recognized, culminating in a reunion that felt more like a meeting between polite strangers. His family's small house in the outskirts of Kyoto had survived the firebombings, a miracle that felt like a curse when he saw the deep, weary lines of grief etched into his parents' faces, the hollow look in his younger sister's eyes. They welcomed him as a son returned from the dead, but they could not comprehend the man who had come back. He was a living relic from a lost world, and the chasm between their shared past and his solitary present was too wide to bridge with words. He found work in a sprawling, cacophonous factory on the city's industrial fringe, a place that manufactured cheap aluminum pots and pans from the salvaged husks of downed aircraft. The work was mindless, repetitive, a brutal symphony of pounding hammers and hissing steam. His hands, once skilled at the delicate dance of flight controls, were now calloused and perpetually smudged with grime. He would stand for 10-hour shifts, feeding sheets of metal into roaring presses. The relentless mechanical noise, a poor substitute for the profound silence of the sky. The factory was a world of tangible, immediate demands, a world of peace, and he moved through it like a sleepwalker, his body present but his soul still adrift over a distant moonlit ocean. At night, the ghost returned, not as shimmering formations in the sky, but as echoes in the quiet of his small, paper-walled room. The rhythmic clang of the factory press would transform in his dreams into the sound of anti-aircraft fire. The whistle of a distant train became the screaming wind of a high-speed dive. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart hammering, the phantom scent of salt air, and aviation fuel clinging to him. The faces of his lost comrades, especially Hiroshi's, would float in the darkness behind his eyelids, their silent, pleading expressions more vivid than the faces of the living people he saw each day. The war was over, but its echoes had followed him home, a private haunting that no surrender document could nullify. Driven by a desperate need to anchor these phantoms to something real, he began to write. In a small, cloth-bound journal purchased from a street vendor, he poured out the entire impossible story. He described the first sighting in meticulous detail, the coalescing lights, the silent, glowing Zeros with their empty cockpits. He transcribed as best he could remember the distorted radio transmission and the chilling clarity of Hiroshi's voice. He wrote of Sato's confession, of the Phantom Squadron's guidance, of their final silent salute over the surrendered island. The act of writing was a compulsion, a nightly ritual of exorcism. The black ink on the creamy paper was a testament, a proof that it had all been real. He made the mistake, once, of trying to share a small part of it. Over a sparse evening meal, he mentioned to his father, a quiet, practical man who had lost his business in the collapse, that he had seen strange things in the sky near the end of the war. His father had listened patiently, then placed a gentle, work-worn hand on his arm. "The war gave all of us bad dreams, son," he had said, his voice heavy with a pity that felt like a physical blow. "You must not let the past poison your future." His mother, overhearing, had begun to cry silent tears, believing her son's mind had been broken by his ordeal. His friends from the old neighborhood, struggling to rebuild their own lives, would quickly change the subject when he grew quiet, their eyes sliding away from his. They saw a man consumed by trauma spinning fantastical tales to cope with unspeakable horror. Their dismissal was a wall of polite, concerned silence, brick by painful brick. With each attempt at connection, Kenji felt himself retreat further, the weight of his unshared truth pressing him deeper into an isolation as vast and impenetrable as the Pacific night. He closed the journal and locked it away in a small wooden chest. The ghosts were his alone to bear, a secret squadron forever flying patrol in the silent, airless space of his memory. 5 years had not been enough to wash the war from the sky. The same stretch of Pacific Ocean that had swallowed empires and dreams now lay under the vigilant gaze of a new power. Lieutenant John Miller of the United States Navy saw it not as a place of ghosts, but as a strategic chessboard of vast blue territory to be monitored and controlled. His world was the cockpit of a Grumman F-2W Guardian, a hulking, prop-driven aircraft whose sole purpose was to extend the eyes of the fleet, its bulky radar dome slung beneath the fuselage like a mechanical parasite. John was a man built for this new Cold War pragmatic, weary, and deeply skeptical of anything that couldn't be quantified, calibrated, or confirmed by a second source. He'd seen enough of real violence in the final push toward Japan to have any patience for the supernatural tales that sometimes circulated in the ready rooms, stories of phantom ships and ghostly pilots that he dismissed as the products of stress, boredom, or too much cheap whiskey. The flight was routine, the kind of mind-numbing patrol that defined peacetime service. Below, the ocean was a sheet of wrinkled blue foil, stretching to a horizon so sharp it looked drawn with a ruler. The sun was a fierce white eye in a bleached-out sky. Inside the cockpit, the air hummed with the thrum of the twin engines and the gentle green glow of the radar scope. John's co-pilot, a young ensign named Davis, was quietly dozing in the right-hand seat. This was John's sky, a domain of logic and machinery, where anomalies were malfunctions and mysteries had technical explanations. His eyes, heavy-lidded from the monotony, flicked to the radar scope. A cluster of faint, fuzzy blips painted the edge of the screen, dancing in and out of resolution. They were weak, indistinct, and didn't match the solid return of a ship or the organized pattern of a flight of aircraft. His first instinct, honed by thousands of hours, was to categorize it. Weather, a localized squall building up its turbulent air and moisture throwing back a confused echo to his radar, or perhaps a flock of large seabirds, their dense formation creating a false signal. He adjusted a dial on the console, the rubberized knob cool under his fingers. The blips wavered, smeared, but refused to resolve into anything identifiable. They moved with a strange, drifting inconsistency, not holding a steady course like man-made objects, yet not scattering like biological entities. He nudged Davis awake with his elbow, pointing a gloved finger at the screen. The ensign leaned forward, squinting. "What do you make of that?" "Bandits?" he asked, his voice still thick with sleep. John shook his head, a short, dismissive motion. "Ghosts in the machine," he grunted, tapping the glass of the scope. "Atmospheric bounce, most likely. Or a glitch in the new modulator. Nothing to write home about." He made a note in his flight log, a brief clinical entry about an unconfirmed radar anomaly, likely weather-related. He was a veteran of a real war, a man who dealt in tangibles. Fuel consumption, engine temps, confirmed contacts. These faint dancing echoes on a screen were beneath his concern, mere static on the clear signal of reality. He banked the Guardian gently, turning it away from the phantom blips, and continued his patrol, leaving the mystery to dissipate like vapor in the vast, rational emptiness of the sky. The night was a different beast entirely. The familiar sun-bleached chessboard of the Pacific vanished, replaced by an abyss of absolute black, where the sea and sky merged into a single, lightless void. John Miller flew through it, a lone bubble of warmth and noise suspended in the crushing silence. The drone of the Guardian's engines was a solitary heartbeat in the immense darkness, The green glow of his instruments, a tiny, defiant campfire against the primordial night. This was a realm for radar and faith, not for human eyes, and John placed his trust entirely in the former. He was scanning the scope, his focus on the clean, electronic representation of the world, when a flicker at the very edge of his peripheral vision made him look up. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of his straining eyes, a phantom after-image from staring too long at the radar's glow. But it persisted, faint, shimmering points of light, like a handful of emerald dust thrown against the black velvet of the sky. They were far off near the horizon, moving with a slow, drifting cadence that was utterly alien. His initial professional assessment was a mirage, a temperature inversion creating a false image of stars on the water. Or his mind supplied with a cold jolt, something Soviet. Some new high-altitude reconnaissance drone or electronic warfare prototype, its running lights muted for stealth. The Cold War was a war of shadows and secrets, and the sky was its primary battleground. He kept his eyes locked on them, his skepticism a shield against the growing unease. The lights continued their silent, weaving dance, and then, as if his attention had given them substance, they began to coalesce. The individual points drew together, their soft glow intensifying, merging into larger, more defined shapes. His breath caught in his throat. The forms were unmistakable. They were aircraft, sleek, single-engine fighters with a distinctive rounded profile he knew all too well from intelligence briefings and wartime recognition manuals. They were Mitsubishi Zeros. But they were Zeros made of light, their fuselages glowing with a sickly, ethereal, green luminescence, their outlines shimmering as if seen through heat haze. There were no engine cowlings, no visible canopies, just these silent, radiant ghosts of a vanquished enemy. Then, the formation shifted. The ghostly squadron, flying in a perfect silent V, tipped its wings as one and began a dive. It was not a tactical descent, but something far more chilling, far more specific. It was a kamikaze dive. The glowing aircraft pointed their noses downward in a steep, deliberate plunge toward the invisible ocean below, holding the fatal trajectory with an unnerving ceremonial precision. They mimicked the final, suicidal moments of a taco attack, a silent, glowing reenactment of a desperate bygone war. There was no roar of engines straining in the dive, no scream of wind, no explosion, only this terrible, silent pantomime of death. A violent shiver completely unrelated to the cockpit's climate racked John's body. It was a chill that started deep in his marrow, a primal cold that seeped outwards, frosting his spine and tightening the skin on his arms. At that exact moment, the world inside his cockpit fractured. The steady green glow of his instrument panel flickered wildly. The altimeter needle danced erratically. The artificial horizon gyrated, making the world tilt. The radio, tuned to the fleet's traffic control frequency, erupted not with static, but with a burst of faint, distorted voices speaking a frantic, rapid-fire Japanese, which was instantly swallowed by a howling gale of spectral wind. Then, just as suddenly, everything snapped back to normal. The instruments glowed steadily. The radio fell silent. The engines hummed their dependable tune. But the chill remained, a permanent resident in his veins. He was a pragmatic man, a man of science and steel, but in that moment, staring at the silent, glowing phantoms replaying their own deaths in the empty sky, John Miller felt the unshakable foundations of his reality crack, and the profound, inexplicable dread flooded the breach. The ghostly squadron hung in the moonless dark, their ethereal green glow blasphemy against the natural order of the night. John Miller's mind, a fortress of logic and wartime pragmatism, lay in smoking ruins. The initial shock of the sighting gave way to a cold, creeping horror that was far worse, a feeling of the world's gears slipping, of reality itself coming unmoored. He was not a man given to fantasy. He dealt in radar blips and fuel consumption, and the hard, unyielding truths of physics and engineering. But the silent, glowing zeros were a truth of a different, more terrifying kind, one that bypassed his intellect and spoke directly to a primal, superstitious core he never knew he possessed. The formation held its kamikaze dive for a heart-stopping moment, a frozen tableau of spectral suicide. Then, as one they pulled up, their silent, impossible maneuver executed with a grace that mocked the laws of aerodynamics. They leveled out just meters above the black, placid surface of the ocean, so close their ghostly light cast a faint, sickly sheen on the wave crests. John's gloved hand, moving with a will of its own, pushed the control yoke forward, descending to keep them in sight to prove to himself that he was not dreaming, that this was really happening. The Guardian, a hulking beast of a plane, groaned in protest, its airframe shuddering as it dropped through the heavy, humid air. He flew parallel to them, a giant, noisy intruder shadowing a procession of silent wraiths. He could see the intricate swirling patterns within their luminescent forms, like clouds of captured St. Elmo's fire. He could make out the faint dark circles where their cockpits should have been, empty voids that seemed to swallow the little light they emitted. And then the lead aircraft tilted its wing again. Without a sound, without a ripple of disturbed air, the entire formation nosed down for a final time. They did not dive so much as they simply descended, gliding into the black water as if it were a welcoming mist. John's breath froze in his lungs. He stared, his eyes straining against the darkness, waiting for the splash. The plume of white water, the evidence of a physical impact. It never came. The glowing zero slid into the ocean's surface as smoothly as a hot knife through butter. There was no splash, no disturbance, not even a circular ripple to mark their passing. The dark, liquid expanse absorbed them whole, swallowing the ghostly light without a trace. One by one, they vanished beneath the waves, their silent, seamless disappearance more unnerving than any violent crash. The ocean looked exactly as it had moments before, a vast, impenetrable darkness. It was as if they had never been there at all, as if the sea had simply opened a door to another world and closed it behind them. His training screamed at him to report it. His hand, trembling violently now, fumbled for the radio transmit button. Guardian 1, to home plate, do you copy? His voice was a ragged, unfamiliar thing in the quiet cockpit. The response was immediate, but it was not the calm, professional voice of the carrier's air controller. It was the same screaming, spectral wind from his earlier encounter, a hurricane of static that felt like it was tearing from the fabric of space itself. And beneath it, layered and faint, were the whispers, Japanese whispers. They were not frantic or pleading this time, but calm, resigned, a sibilant overlapping murmur that sounded like a prayer or a final collective sigh. He heard the word sayonara clear and distinct, woven into the fabric of the howling void. He ripped his hand from the controls as if burned, cutting the transmission. The sudden, absolute silence was deafening. His heart hammered against his ribs, a wild, panicked drum. He was thousands of miles from home, alone in the dark over an endless ocean, and he had just witnessed the impossible. The ghosts were real. They had flown a silent patrol and performed a silent, splashless dive into a grave that would not hold them. The rational part of his mind had no box to put this in, no file to categorize it. It was simply impossible, and yet he had seen it. His hands, slick with sweat, gripped the yoke. Every instinct told him to get out of this air, to put solid, real ground beneath his feet. He wrenched the Guardian to a steep, banking turn, its engines roaring in protest, a sound that was blessedly, mundanely loud. He pushed the throttles forward, abandoning his patrol route, his mission, everything. He was not fleeing an enemy he could fight. He was fleeing a truth he could not comprehend. The flight back to the carrier was a blur of instrument checks and a desperate internal struggle to reconcile what he knew with what he had seen. He landed with a jarring thud on the flight deck, the screech of tires and the tug of the arrestor wire, a welcome assault on his senses. As he climbed down from the cockpit, his legs weak and unsteady, He was not the same man who had taken off hours before. He was a man unmoored, shaken to his very core, and profoundly, terrifyingly confused by the silent, impossible dive that now played on an endless loop behind his eyes. The sterile, air-conditioned chill of the carrier's intelligence office did nothing to cool the feverish heat under John Miller's skin. He sat on a hard metal chair, his flight suit still smelling of sweat and aviation fuel, his hands clasped tightly in his lap to hide their faint, persistent tremor. Across a Formica-top desk sat Commander Evans, a man whose crisp uniform and neatly parted hair seemed to embody the Navy's entire worldview, order, logic, and an unshakable faith in the tangible. John laid it out as clearly as he could, his voice low and measured, fighting to keep the ragged edge of panic from his words. He described the lights, the coalescing shapes, the silent, glowing zeros, and their impossible splashless. Dive into the sea. He mentioned the instrument flicker, the distorted radio transmission, the whispers. He presented the facts as he had witnessed them, stripped of emotion, a pilot's report of an unexplained aerial phenomenon. Commander Evans listened with an expression of polite, professional patience that slowly hardened into stony disbelief. He did not interrupt, but his eyes, cool and assessing, never left John's face. When John finished, the silence in the room was thick and heavy. Evans leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking and steepled his fingers. He began with the most benign explanation, his tone that of a weary professor addressing a particularly fanciful student. Stress-induced hallucination, the pressures of long-range patrol, the isolation, the lingering effects of wartime service, it was a well-documented phenomenon. He explained, for the mind to conjure vivid imagery under duress. The brain, seeking patterns in the void, could create entire narratives from atmospheric refractions and simple fatigue. When John remained silent, his jaw tight, Evans moved to the next possibility, his voice taking on a sharper, more dismissive edge. A hoax, a deliberate, sophisticated deception perpetrated by an unknown adversary, likely the Soviets, using advanced projection technology or electronic warfare to test their responses, to sow confusion and gauge their capabilities. It was a plausible, if unsettling, theory that kept the incident firmly within the realm of human conflict, a problem of technology and geopolitics, not phantoms. Then came the reassignment. It was delivered not as a punishment, but as a concerned recommendation, a decision made for his own well-being. Effective immediately, Lieutenant Miller was grounded. His flight status was revoked. He was being transferred to a desk job in a records annex at Pearl Harbor, a windowless room where he would process supply requisitions and update filing systems. It was a place where a tired, overactive imagination could do no harm. The message was clear and brutal. His judgment was no longer trusted. Finally, the warning. Evans stood up, his posture rigid, his gaze boring into John. The conversation they had just had was to be considered classified. He was not to discuss the details of his patrol, his so-called sighting, with anyone, not his fellow officers, not the enlisted men, and certainly not anyone outside the Navy. Spreading such unsubstantiated, fantastical stories was not only a breach of protocol, but it was also damaging to morale and the professional reputation of the service. It was an order delivered with the flat, final tone of a tombstone being laid. Dismissed, John walked out of the office and into the bright, noisy chaos of the carrier's hangar deck. The shriek of power tools, the shouts of crew chiefs, the solid, real presence of aircraft being serviced, it all felt like a mockery. The Navy, the institution he had dedicated his life to, had just taken his experience, his terrifying, world-altering certainty, and buried it under a mound of bureaucratic jargon and condescending logic. They had filed his truth away in a drawer labeled fatigue and vox, and reassigned him to a post where he could be quietly monitored and forgotten. A hot, bitter frustration began to boil in his chest, eclipsing his earlier fear. He wasn't crazy, and it wasn't a Soviet trick. He had seen the dead fly their eternal patrol, and the United States Navy, in its infinite rational wisdom, was choosing to look the other way. The truth wasn't just being ignored, it was being actively systematically buried, and the weight of that knowledge felt heavier than any bomb he had ever carried. The windowless records annex at Pearl Harbor was a tomb for paper, a cavernous space that smelled of dust, old ink, and slow decay. For John Miller, it was a purgatory of filing cabinets in triplicate forms, a deliberate exile from the sky. The Navy had silenced him, but it had not extinguished the cold fire of certainty that burned in his gut. The memory of the silent, glowing dive played behind his eyes during the long, monotonous hours. A ghostly film reel he could not shut off. The official narrative fatigue, hoax, hallucination was a flimsy cage, and the truth was a wild thing rattling the bars. If the Navy would not listen, he would find his own answers. He would dig. His new position, meant to bury him in irrelevance, became his greatest weapon. The annex was a repository for the war's bureaucratic detritus, a labyrinth of declassified after-action reports, intelligence summaries, and prisoner-of-war interrogations. After his shift ended, when the other clerks had departed, John would remain. He moved through the silent, dusty aisles with the focused intensity of a predator on a scent, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. He started with the broadest search parameters. Unexplained aerial phenomena, Pacific Theater, 1945. The initial results were the expected dross meteorological balloons misidentified as enemy aircraft, radar glitches, pilot error. But then, he found the first thread. It was a slim, unassuming file, its cover stamped with the faded words POW testimonials, psychological anomalies. Inside were transcripts of debriefings with captured Japanese pilots, their words translated into stiff formal English. Most spoke of tactical deployments and unit strengths, but a handful, those from the war's final desperate months, contained cryptic, unsettling passages. They were often buried in footnotes or appended as irrelevant addenda by the interviewing officers. One pilot, captured on a small island garrison, spoke of skylights that flew without sound and the voices of lost brothers on the wind. Another, from a different unit, described seeing empty Zero-Sen flying in perfect formation during night patrols, their pilots already with the gods. The reports dismissed these accounts as battle fatigue or cultural superstition, but John's pulse quickened. They were echoes, faint but unmistakable, of his own experience. He cross-referenced the locations, the dates, the unit designations. The threads began to weave together, pointing toward a specific forgotten corner of the war. A remote island outpost, its garrison designation matching one mentioned repeatedly in the more coherent testimonies. And then he found the name. It was scrawled in the margin of one transcript by a more diligent, or perhaps more curious, intelligence officer. A note questioning the consistency of these phantom squadron stories, and a reference to a series of essays published post-war by a former pilot of that very garrison, a man named Kenji Tanaka. The hunt narrowed, his obsession a fever now. He used his service credentials to access civilian periodical archives, scouring obscure Japanese journals and philosophical magazines from the late 1940s. And there it was, in a small, intellectual publication dedicated to wartime memory and spiritual reconciliation. He found them. 3 essays by Kenji Tanaka. Their titles were poetic, haunting, echoes in the empty sky, the whispers of the divine wind, and on the eternal patrol of lost souls. John's hands trembled as he held the fragile yellowed pages. He could not read the Japanese text, but the translated abstracts provided for library cataloging were enough. They spoke of ghostly aircraft, of silent formations of dead comrades guiding the living, of a haunting that transcended the end of the war. He paid a university student to translate the essays in full. When he received the pages, he read them not in the dusty annex, but alone in his small Spartan quarters. As he read Kenji Tanaka's words, a profound and chilling validation settled over him. Here was a man on the other side of the world, on the other side of the conflict, who had seen the same impossible things. Kenji described the cold luminescence, the empty cockpits, the silent acrobatic flights. He wrote of the magnetic pull, the guidance that felt like a protective hand. He detailed the radio distortions, the whispers of the dead, the voice of his friend Hiroshi. It was all there. Every detail John had witnessed and reported, every detail the Navy had dismissed, was corroborated in the quiet, thoughtful prose of a former enemy pilot. The frustration he had felt at the Navy's denial was gone, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. He was not crazy. He was a witness, and now he had found another. The connection was real, a bridge of shared terror and wonder, spanning the Pacific and the years of peace. The Phantom Squadron was not a hallucination. It was a phenomenon, one that had touched Kenji Tanaka in 1945 and John Miller in 1950. The mystery was no longer a personal burden. It was a puzzle to be solved, a truth to be dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light. Lying in his bunk that night, the translated essays spread across his chest. John Miller was no longer a disgraced pilot on desk duty. He was an investigator, a seeker, and his obsession with uncovering the full, terrifying connection between himself, Kenji Tanaka, and the ghosts of a forgotten war had just begun. The world had shrunk to the four walls of his quarters and the sprawling, untranslatable truth contained in Kenji Tanaka's essays. John Miller moved through his clerical duties in the record's annex like an automaton, his body processing forms while his mind soared over a moonlit Pacific, flying in formation with a ghost he had never met. The validation he felt was not a warm comfort, but a sharp, cold clarity. The Phantom Squadron was real. Its existence was no longer a question of his sanity, but a historical and supernatural fact, corroborated by a voice from the other side of the war. The Navy's dismissal now seemed like a childish refusal to look under the bed, a willful ignorance that only deepened his resolve. He had to make contact. He had to speak to the one other man who understood. The historian, a doctor, Albright, was a relic himself, a dusty academic tucked away in a university on the American East Coast, his specialty the cultural history of the Pacific War. John's letter to him was a carefully constructed piece of work, a blend of official inquiry and personal desperation. He posed as a naval researcher following up on declassified anomalies, expressing a scholarly interest in the post-war writings of former Japanese pilots, specifically the philosophical essays of one Kenji Tanaka. He included a copy of his service record to lend weight to his request, hoping the man's academic curiosity would outweigh any suspicion. Weeks of agonizing silence followed. John's hope began to curdle into despair. Then, a thin, airmail envelope arrived, its foreign stamps a vibrant promise. Albright's response was brief but pivotal. He confirmed Kenji Tanaka was alive, living quietly in the Kyoto prefecture. He included a forwarding address noting that the former pilot was known to be reclusive and had cut ties with most veteran associations, but that he occasionally corresponded with those who approached his work with genuine intellectual respect. It was a thread, gossamer thin, stretching across the world. John clutched it with everything he had. He composed his first letter to Kenji with the painstaking care of a man defusing a bomb. He introduced himself not as Lieutenant Miller, U.S. Navy, but as John, a fellow pilot who had seen something impossible in the sky. He wrote of the silent, glowing formations, the Kamikaze pantomime, the splashless dive. He described the instrument failure, the howling static, the Japanese whispers on a secured American frequency. He did not ask for confirmation. He offered his own testimony as a mirror, hoping it would reflect a shared image. He sealed the letter, the act feeling as momentous as launching from a carrier deck, and sent it out into the world, a message in a bottle, cast into a sea of doubt. The wait was an eternity. Every day, John checked his mailbox with a frantic, hopeful dread. Then the reply came. The envelope was of fine rice paper, the handwriting precise and elegant. Kenji Tanaka's response was formal, guarded, but the words themselves were dam-breaking. He thanked John for his letter, acknowledging the strangeness of their correspondence. Then he began to write his own story onto the page. He described the crumbling garrison, the desolate patrols, the first sighting of the faint dancing lights that solidified into ghostly zeros. His prose was vivid, painting a picture of a young man's terror and awe. He wrote of the voices of his dead friend Hiroshi's plea echoing from a storm of static, a detail that made John's skin prickle with recognition. As the letters crossed the Pacific, a bridge of ink and shared dread was built between them. Kenji sent detailed sketches of the formations, the diamond V, the specific angles of their was, banks and dives. He described the feeling of the invisible tether, the gentle, insistent pull that had guided him away from danger. John in turn mapped his own sightings against Kenji's descriptions. The patterns were not just similar, they were identical. The way the phantoms held their formation, the silent fluid grace of their maneuvers, the specific unnatural green of their luminescence, it was all the same. Even the radio distortions followed a pattern, the screaming wind, the layered whispers, the sudden chilling clarity of a single recognizable voice from the grave. Sitting at his small desk, surrounded by the Navy's forgotten paperwork, John laid Kenji's latest letter next to his own hastily scribbled notes. He traced the flight paths described by the Japanese pilot with his finger, then overlaid them with his own. They matched. The Phantom Squadron that had haunted a desperate garrison in 1945 was the very same one that had flown a silent, mocking patrol for a U.S. Navy pilot in 1950. They were not just random apparitions. They were a permanent, repeating feature of that patch of sky, an eternal loop of a final lost mission. The connection was no longer a theory or a hope. It was a geometric, undeniable fact. Two men, enemies turned allies by a secret only they shared, had locked eyes across time and space, and in that silent paper-based communion, the ghosts became more real than the governments that denied them. The journey to Japan felt less like a voyage across the Pacific and more like a passage through a veil, from a world of official denial into one of profound personal truth. For John Miller, the hum of the aircraft, the bureaucratic shuffle of customs, the blur of unfamiliar landscapes from a train window, all of it, was a prelude, the mundane world holding its breath before the curtain rose on a meeting that defied the logic of two nations and the passage of a war. The address led him not to a bustling city center, but to the quiet, mist-shrouded outskirts of Kyoto, where the ancient stillness of the land seemed to absorb the clamor of the modern world. The tea house was tucked away at the end of a narrow stone path. Surrounded by a carefully raked garden of moss and stone, its wooden frame weathered to a soft silver gray. It was a place outside of time, a perfect sanctuary for a conversation that belonged to neither past nor present, but to some eternal haunted in-between. Inside, the air was hushed and fragrant with the scent of green tea and aged wood. The light was soft, filtering through paper screens and casting long, gentle shadows, and there, seated on a tatami mat before a low, lacquered table, was Kenji Tanaka. The man John had come to know through elegant script and haunting descriptions was now a physical presence, and the sight of him sent a jolt of sobering reality through John's system. Kenji was older, much older than his years should have allowed. His hair was a shock of white, his frame thin and slightly stooped, as if bearing a permanent invisible weight. But it was his eyes that held John captive. They were dark, deep-set pools of weary intelligence, and they held a sadness so vast and settled, it was less an emotion and more a state of being. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the seams of the world unravel and had spent a lifetime trying to stitch them back together with memory and ink. They bowed, the formal gesture bridging the gap of language and history. No translator was present. They had agreed on this, a silent pact that their shared secret required no intermediary. They sat, and for a long moment the only sound was the gentle hiss of steam from the iron kettle and the distant, melodic trickle of a garden fountain. Kenji performed the tea ceremony with a slow, deliberate grace, each movement a meditation. His hands, though lined with age, were steady as they poured the pale green liquid into two ceramic bowls. The ritual was a language in itself, a shared silence that said more than words could about respect, patience, and the gravity of the moment. When Kenji finally spoke, his voice was a low, rustling whisper, like wind through dried bamboo. He did not begin with pleasantries or reminiscence of the war. He went directly to the heart of the mystery, his theory forged in the crucible of 5 years of solitude and a lifetime of reflection. He spoke of the spirits not as random hauntings, but as souls caught in a celestial snare. His theory, explained with the quiet certainty of a physicist describing a natural law, was that they were trapped. They were not at rest, nor were they malevolent. They were ensnared in an eternal repeating loop of their final decisive missions. The moment of their greatest duty, their ultimate sacrifice, had become a prison from which their consciousness could not escape. They were echoes of a single catastrophic instant, replaying their last patrol, their last dive, their last transmission, over and over, again in a silent, ghostly theater for which the living were only occasional, bewildered spectators. He looked at John, his weary eyes seeming to see right through him, past the American flight suit and the naval credentials, to the core of the man who had witnessed the impossible. He explained that their appearances were not random visitations, but points where the loop intersected with the world of the living. When a receptive soul, a pilot alone in the vastness, his mind attuned to the same frequencies of duty and solitude, could perceive their endless tragic performance. They were not trying to communicate, he said. They were simply being forever frozen in the act of their own ending, their silent screams and final maneuvers etched onto the fabric of that particular stretch of sky for all eternity. As Kenji's words settled in the quiet room, a profound and overwhelming sense of validation washed over John. It was a feeling so powerful it was almost physical, a release of a tension he had carried since the moment his instruments had flickered over the dark Pacific. The Navy's dismissals, the condescending diagnoses of stress and hallucination, the lonely frustration, all of it melted away in the face of this quiet, weary man's unshakable conviction. Kenji had given the Phantom Squadron a name, a reason, a tragic, beautiful logic. He had transformed John's terrifying encounter from a symptom of a broken mind into a piece of a vast, sorrowful puzzle. John was not crazy. He was a witness. He had brushed against the ragged edge of eternity, and in this quiet tea house at the far side of the world, he had found the one other person who understood the weight of that touch. He did not need to speak his agreement. He simply looked at Kenji and gave a slow, deep nod. In that silent exchange, a bond was sealed, stronger than any alliance of nations, forged in the cold fire of a truth that only they, in all the world, possessed. The validation they had found in each other's company felt like a fragile, precious flame, but the world outside the quiet tea house was a vast, cold expanse designed to snuff it out. Armed with Kenji's meticulously kept journal, his sketches, and John's official, if censored, naval report, they embarked on a quixotic quest for official acknowledgement. Their first stop was a mid-level bureau within the Japanese Ministry of Health and Welfare, an office that dealt with the lingering effects of the war. The official who met them was a young, crisply suited man whose polite smile was a mask of bureaucratic impenetrability. He listened to Kenji's measured account with a look of pain tolerance, his eyes glazing over as John presented the correlated evidence. The response was a masterclass in institutional deflection. There were no records, no corroborating data. The esteemed Mr. Street Tanaka's experiences were, without question, a tragic but understandable manifestation of profound wartime trauma. To suggest otherwise would be to venture into areas of national sensitivity best left undisturbed. The unspoken words hung in the air, heavy and final. It was not in the national interest to resurrect the ghosts of a defeated, discredited military. Undeterred, John used his remaining service contacts to secure a meeting with a liaison officer at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. The setting was a sterile conference room, all polished mahogany and the scent of floor wax. The American officer, a colonel with a firm handshake and eyes the color of an overcast sky, was even more blunt. He dismissed John's report out of hand, citing a lack of physical evidence in the well-documented phenomenon of sensory distortion, during long-duration flights over featureless terrain. When John pressed, mentioning the declassified POW testimonials, the colonel's affable demeanor hardened. He invoked the sacred trinity of modern statecraft, national security, operational integrity, and the potential for geopolitical embarrassment. The suggestion that U.S. airspace was patrolled by spectral Japanese warplanes was a narrative that could be exploited by adversaries. It was a matter, he stated with cold finality, that was not open for discussion. The case was closed, and Lieutenant Miller's continued pursuit of it would be viewed as a breach of his sworn oath. Their final, desperate hope was the press. They found a sympathetic ear in a young, ambitious journalist named Aiko Tanaka, no relation, who worked for a progressive Tokyo weekly. She was captivated by the story, by the convergence of two pilots from opposing sides, by the haunting, poetic tragedy of the Eternal Patrol. She spent days with them, her notebook filling with their synchronized accounts, her eyes alight with the promise of a story that transcended politics. She began her preliminary investigations, making discreet calls to archival sources and former military personnel. For a few days, it seemed a crack of light had appeared. Then, the pressure came, not as a thunderclap, but as a silent, pervasive frost. Aiko's editor, a man who had initially encouraged her, called her into his office. He spoke not of the story's merit, but of its potential repercussions. He mentioned in vague but menacing terms concerns raised by influential figures about dredging up painful, divisive history. He spoke of the magazine's delicate advertising contracts, its need to maintain access to government sources. The message was clear and unyielding. The next day, Aiko met Kenji and John in a quiet park. Her face was pale, her earlier fire extinguished. She explained, her voice thick with a shame she could not conceal, that she had been reassigned. She was being sent to cover a municipal budget crisis in a distant prefecture. The ghost story was dead, she apologized, not meeting their eyes, before turning and walking quickly away. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of a silence that had been forcibly purchased. Kenji and John watched her go, the last flicker of their hope dying with her retreating figure. The truth had not been refuted. It had been rendered irrelevant by the immense, indifferent machinery of the state, a machinery that operated not on proof, but on the cold calculus of power and perception. They were left standing alone, the sole keepers of a secret too immense for the world to bear, the theme of institutional silence now a wall they could not scale. The chartered fishing boat was a world of creaking wood and the sharp, honest scent of brine and diesel, a stark contrast to the sterile offices of denial they had so recently departed. Its captain, a grizzled, silent man who asked no questions for the generous sum he was paid, navigated by the stars and the worn charts in his wheelhouse, taking them to the coordinates burned into both their memories. For Kenji, it was a return to the geography of his nightmares and his salvation. For John, it was a pilgrimage to the source of the mystery that had upended his life. They stood at the rail as the sun bled out over the horizon, painting the endless water in shades of fire and blood before surrendering to a vast moonless darkness. The island was a low black hump in the distance, a sleeping leviathan they had no need to approach. They had come for the sky, the night wrapped around them, absolute and profound. The only sounds were the lap of water against the hull and the low thrum of the idling engine. The captain had cut the lights, leaving them adrift in an inkwell, the Milky Way a dizzying diamond-dusted river overhead. They waited, two old men, one from the east, one from the west, bound by a secret that transcended language and flags. Kenji stood with a stillness that seemed to draw the silence around him, his eyes, still sharp despite his years, fixed on the patch of sky where his war had never ended. John leaned against the rail, his video camera, a bulky new piece of technology he had purchased for this sole purpose, resting on the wood beside him. Its unblinking red eye a tiny futile protest against the coming impossibility. They came not as a gradual emergence, but as a sudden breathtaking wound in the fabric of the night. One moment the sky was a cathedral of stars, the next it was occupied. The Phantom Squadron materialized directly ahead, their arrivals silent and total. They were more vivid, more horrifically real than John had ever seen them from his cockpit. The same unearthly green luminescence, the same perfect diamond-winged formation. But this time, from this low, stable vantage, they could see more. The light was not uniform. Within the glowing outlines of the Zero fuselages, faint shadows were visible. They were the silhouettes of men etched in negative space against the internal radiance, their forms hunched over controls that were not there, their heads encased in the ghostly outlines of flight helmets. They were not just empty planes, they were occupied tombs. The shadows of the pilots forever fused to their machines, their final determined postures preserved in this eternal repeating moment. The formation flew past the boat at an unnervingly low altitude, close enough that John could feel the profound, unnatural cold radiating from them, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. There was no sound, no disturbance in the air, only the silent, majestic, and utterly tragic procession of the dead. He fumbled for his camera, his hands clumsy with a reverence that felt like fear. He raised the viewfinder to his eye, the electronic image a pale, ghostly imitation of the reality before him. He pressed record, the whir of the tiny mechanism a blasphemous noise in the holy silence. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the footage would show nothing. It would be a tape of empty, star-dusted sky, a testament to the failure of technology to capture a truth that existed only for the soul. He was not documenting proof. He was performing a rite, a final, futile gesture of witness. As the last of the glowing aircraft began to pass, Kenji, who had been as still as a stone carving, finally moved. He took a small, hesitant step forward, his thin frame outlined against the spectral glow. He brought his hands together, not in a military salute, but in the ancient, gentle gesture of prayer. He bowed his head, and his whisper was so soft it was almost a thought, a breath of sound carried on the wind that did not stir. "Yasurakan ni Nemur," he murmured. "Rest in peace." The words hung in the air, a fragile human offering laid at the feet of the impossible. The Phantom Squadron continued its silent, unwavering course, unaffected by the prayer, untouched by the recording. They flew on, their shadows locked in an endless duty, their patrol a permanent scar on the night. John lowered the camera, its red light still glowing, a tiny, mocking beacon of a truth that could never be believed by the world they would return to. They had come to find. The ghosts, and in doing so, had found only the profound, unbridgeable chasm between what they knew and what could ever be proven. They stood together in the darkness, watching the silent, glowing procession until it faded into the distant blackness, leaving behind only the stars and the heavy shared weight of a secret that was now, and forever, theirs alone. The long voyage back to the mainland was a journey not across water, but through the quiet landscape of a settled soul. Kenji Tanaka stood at the rail of the transport ship, the salt wind teasing his white hair, his gaze fixed not on the receding horizon of the ghost-haunted sea, but on the vast, empty, and finally peaceful sky above. The chilling vision of the shadow pilots, their forms fused eternally to their machines, had been the final searing revelation. It was not a curse he had witnessed all those years, but a vigil. The spirits were not trapped in a loop of torment. They were standing in eternal guard. Their endless patrol a silent, sacred duty to the comrades in the homeland they had died to protect. They were not screaming in silent agony. They were watching. The weight of fear and confusion that had pressed upon him for a decade lifted, leaving in its place a profound, sorrowful reverence. The ghosts were not his tormentors. They were his guardians, and in that understanding, Kenji Tanaka found a peace deeper than any he had known since he was a boy in his father's orchard. For John Miller, watching Kenji's tranquil profile against the rising sun, the trip back was a different kind of arrival. The Navy's world of regulations, denials, and cold, hard facts felt like a distant, childish dream. He had touched a truth that made a mockery of security clearances and official reports. The Phantom Squadron was real. He had seen it with Kenji, had felt its silent, chilling presence. and had witnessed the profound peace it brought the old man. That was the only proof that mattered. The desk job at Pearl, the condescending glances of his former superiors, the entire structure of his life. It was all a gilded cage he no longer had to inhabit. By the time the ship docked in Yokohama, his decision was made. He would not return. He drafted his letter of resignation from the United States Navy with a steady hand, citing personal reasons, feeling not a shred of regret. Only the exhilarating lightness of a man who has finally dropped a burden he was never meant to carry. He found a small, quiet room in a Tokyo boarding house, its single window looking out over a tangle of telephone wires and tiled roofs. On a simple wooden desk, he laid out a fresh ream of paper and a new pen. He had a new mission now, one far more important than any patrol. He would write it all down. Not as a report for a disinterested government, but as a testament. He would write the story of Kenji Tanaka, the young pilot on a forgotten island. He would write of the shimmering lights, the silent formations, the voice of Hiroshi pleading from the storm. He would write of his own disbelief. The chilling Kamikaze pantomime, the splashless dive. He would weave their two narratives into one, a single unassailable account of the eternal patrol. It would be a book for the few who might understand, for the future, for the truth itself. It was a duty he owed to Kenji, to the ghosts, and to the part of himself that had forever been altered by the silent, glowing sky. Their parting came on a platform at Tokyo's Central Station, a place of steam and hurried goodbyes. Kenji was returning to his quiet life in Kyoto. John was staying to begin his. There were no grand speeches, no promises to meet again. They simply stood facing each other, two men from different worlds, their shared history not of battles fought, but of a mystery endured. Kenji bowed, a deep, respectful gesture that spoke of a bond deeper than friendship. John returned the bow, the unfamiliar motion, feeling more natural than any salute he had ever given. They clasped hands, the grip firm and lasting. A final physical acknowledgement of the immense, invisible weight they would now carry separately but forever share. And Kenji turned and boarded his train. John watched the carriages pull away, the old man's face a pale moon at the window, until it vanished into the haze. They were parting ways, but the secret they carried, the weight of a truth too vast for the world to hold, would bind them together long after the last echo of the train had faded, a silent, enduring fellowship of the haunted sky. Decades are but a blink to the ocean, and the sky holds its secrets tighter still. The world spun on, stitching over the scars of war with new technologies, new conflicts, new generations of pilots who flew faster and higher than Kenji or John could have ever dreamed. Supersonic jets now scribed contrails across the stratosphere, and commercial airliners, behemoths of pressurized comfort, charted ceaseless highways through the clouds. The remote garrison and the naval patrols faded into the yellowed pages of history books, their specific coordinates and personal terrors smoothed into the general narrative of a bygone era. But the Phantom Squadron did not fade. It persisted, a permanent, repeating flaw in the film of reality, its performance uninterrupted by the turning of centuries. These later witnesses were not desperate soldiers or skeptical naval officers. They were modern pilots trained in digital avionics and global positioning systems, their faith placed in the infallibility of radar and satellite data. And so, when they saw the lights, the reaction was not terror, but a profound professional confusion that quickly curdled into a private, guarded dread. A French Air Force pilot on a training exercise over the international waters would note a cluster of anomalous returns on his screen, returns that moved with an impossible synchronicity before vanishing. Australian cargo pilot, flying a night route from Honolulu to Sydney, would glance from his cockpit to see a faint greenish glow keeping pace with his wing for a heart-stopping minute before it winked out. They would report the incidents in terse technical language, attributing them to atmospheric phenomena, solar flare activity, or unexplained sensor ghosting. Their superiors, men who had never known the intimate silence of a prop-driven cockpit, would concur, filing the reports away in the digital equivalent of a dusty drawer. The fear of being labeled unstable, of losing their hard-won flight status, of becoming the subject of ready-room ridicule, was a more potent silencer than any official order. They saw they were shaken, and they chose silence, adding their names to a secret, unspoken fraternity. The latest initiate was a young commercial pilot named Liam, flying a wide-body jet on the graveyard shift from Los Angeles to Tokyo. He was of a generation that viewed the past as a series of mildly interesting documentaries, the Second World War a black-and-white abstraction. He was navigating by GPS and sipping terrible coffee when he saw it, a formation of faint star-like lights drifting far below his cruising altitude, moving in a tight, precise diamond pattern that no satellite or air traffic control system had logged. He leaned forward, his brow furrowed, and watched as the lights pulsed, coalescing for a fleeting instant into the unmistakable, shimmering silhouettes of old-fashioned fighter planes before dissolving back into indistinct points of light. A cold finger traced its way down his spine, a sensation utterly alien in his climate-controlled, technologically assured world. He said nothing to his co-pilot, who was engrossed in a novel, but the image was seared into his mind. Later, during his rest break, he pulled out his personal tablet, the ghostly formation nagging at him. He typed a hesitant, fragmented search into a browser. Ghost Planes Pacific. Strange lights. Old rumors? The algorithm, indifferent to his unease, delivered a scattering of results. Forum posts from other pilots, speaking in vague, guarded terms. A cryptic reference in a decades-old article about post-war psychological trauma. And then, buried deep, a mention of a self-published book by a former U.S. Navy pilot named John Miller. A book that few had read and fewer still believed, titled The Eternal Patrol. Liam did not purchase the book. He did not delve deeper. He simply closed the browser, a cold understanding settling in his gut. He had seen something that was not meant for the modern world, something that belonged to the realm of old rumors and hushed, fearful knowledge. He made a conscious, deliberate choice to add his sighting to the silent archive, to lock it away as a personal, unexplainable event. He returned to the cockpit, the mystery now a part of him, and the cycle of hidden knowledge was, once again, quietly, effortlessly, perpetuated. The mission of the lost was unending, and the living, bound by fear and a strange, unspoken loyalty, would forever be its reluctant, silent guardians. The small, sunlit room in Kenji's Kyoto home was a sanctuary of quiet order, a world away from the screaming winds and phantom lights that now existed only in memory and ink. The independent researcher, a young woman named Akari with earnest eyes and a digital recorder, sat opposite him, her presence a bridge between his solitary world and the one that had long since moved on. Kenji, wrapped in a simple yukata, his frame frail but his posture still carrying the ghost of a pilot's discipline, felt the weight of the years not as a burden but as a lens through which the past had finally come into focus. He was the last custodian of a story that official records had expunged, a living relic of a truth that bureaucracy had deemed inconvenient. As Akari switched on her recorder, its tiny red light a silent, unblinking witness, he knew this was not an interview, but a passing of FOV, the torch, a final act of duty in a long life defined by it. He spoke not with the frantic energy of his youth, but with the slow, measured cadence of a man recounting a sacred text. His voice, a dry rustle of leaves, filled the quiet space as he painted the picture of the crumbling garrison, the oppressive solitude, the first terrifying glimpse of the lights that were not stars. He did not shy from the fear, the isolation, the way his own command had dismissed him. He spoke of Hiroshi's voice, a sound that still, on the quietest of nights, could echo in the chambers of his heart. But the terror was now tempered by a profound understanding. He explained to Akari how war does not end with treaties and surrenders. It leaves echoes. It carves scars not just on the land and the body, but on the very fabric of the world. And sometimes, for those standing in the right place at the right time, those scars become visible. The Phantom Squadron was not a hallucination. It was one such echo. A permanent reverberation of sacrifice and lost youth, a silent testament to the moment honor and duty collided with oblivion. He looked at the young researcher, her face a canvas of intense concentration, and he saw in her the same spark of unwavering resolve that had once burned in John Miller. He told her of their meeting, their failed attempt to be heard, their final silent vigil on the dark sea. He spoke of the shadows in the cockpits, the eternal, frozen postures of the pilots, and the profound peace he had found in recognizing their flight not as a curse, but as a form of guardianship. Their sacrifice had been for something greater than a lost empire. It was for the intangible bonds of brotherhood, a duty that even death could not nullify. This, he impressed upon her, was the true legacy of the lost, not the politics of the war, but the enduring, heartbreaking cost of it, a cost paid in young lives whose echo would never fully fade from the world. When he finished, the room was steeped in a heavy, respectful silence. The recorder had captured it all. Every whispered confession, every refined theory. Akari switched it off, the click sounding like a period at the end of a very long sentence. She looked at the elderly man before her, a living archive of a denied history, and she felt the weight of his trust settle upon her shoulders. She knew what he was asking without him having to say the words. The governments would continue to deny, the experts would continue to scoff, the world would continue to prioritize its comfortable rational truths. But the story itself was a truth of a different order. She met his gaze, her own eyes glistening with a fierce, determined light. She did not speak of publication or fame. She simply bowed her head, a gesture of deep respect, and made a vow, not to him, but to the ghosts he had served for a lifetime. She would preserve the tale. She would protect this fragile, impossible legacy. She would become its next guardian, ensuring that the silent, eternal patrol of the lost would never truly be forgotten, no matter how many official denials were stacked against it. The drone's eye view rendered the Pacific in a grid of cold digital clarity, a mosaic of blue hues and wave pattern algorithms. From his climate-controlled station in Nevada, Airman First Class Ben Carter saw the ocean not as a vast living entity, but as a data stream, a theater of operations monitored through a high-resolution screen. His war was fought with joysticks and keyboard commands, his enemies pixelated targets in a sterile, silent game. The mission was routine surveillance, a long-duration orbit over a patch of international waters noted for nothing more than its profound emptiness. The sky was a flat, cloudless blue in the feed, the ocean a placid, sun-dappled expanse. It was the most boring assignment on the board, a testament to the utter peace that technology had imposed upon this forgotten corner of the world. Then, the anomaly flickered into existence at the extreme edge of the camera's sweep. It was not a ship, not a weather pattern, not a flock of birds. The object recognition software, trained on the profiles of modern vessels and aircraft, stuttered, its confidence percentage plummeting into the red. Carter leaned forward, his brow furrowed. He zoomed the camera, the image tightening on a cluster of faint, shimmering points of light. They were arranged in a perfect geometric formation, a diamond-winged V that was uckingly familiar from historical Sims and vintage war documentaries. The lights pulsed with a soft internal radiance, their color an unnatural, ethereal green that the camera's white balance could not correct. They moved with a silent, fluid synchrony that defied the physics of flight, weaving through the empty air without disturbing it. For a full 30 seconds, the drone's advanced sensors captured the silent, glowing procession. Then, as if acknowledging their observer, the formation banked as one in a maneuver that was both impossibly precise and utterly alien, and vanished. Not by accelerating away, but by simply dissolving, the individual lights winking out of existence until only the empty blue sky remained. Carter saved the clip, flagging it as a Class B UAP unidentified aerial phenomenon. He wrote his report with meticulous technical detail, describing the object's flight characteristics, its lack of heat signature, its radar stealth properties, and the system's failure to classify it. The response from the higher echelons was swift and dismissive. A team of experts, men who had never felt the sun on their faces or the wind in their hair, analyzed the data. Their conclusion was a masterpiece of technological arrogance. Swarm of high-altitude drones, they suggested, their synchronized flight explained by a sophisticated master-slave programming glitch. A rare atmospheric inversion, they proposed, creating a complex mirage of celestial bodies, corruption in the drone's own data link transmission, a ghost in the machine. The clip was archived under explain/atmospheric optical effects, its mystery neatly solved by the sterile logic of ones and zeros. The circle of denial had closed tighter and more impervious than ever, fortified by the very technology that had captured the proof. But the footage did not disappear entirely. It seeped out, as all secrets eventually do, into the darker, quieter corners of the internet. It was in one of these digital backwaters that an elderly man, his hands gnarled with arthritis, watched the grainy, stabilized video on his computer screen. John Miller, now living in a quiet retirement community in Arizona, felt his breath catch in his chest. He was decades and a continent away from the moonlit cockpit of his guardian, but the sight on the screen sent him hurtling back through time. The formation, the color, the silent, impossible grace, it was all exactly as he remembered. He was not. Surprised by the expert's dismissal, he had expected nothing less. He was, however, filled with a weary, profound sense of vindication. The technology had failed to explain the phenomenon because the phenomenon was not of this world. It was a truth of memory and spirit, not of physics and data packets. He closed the browser, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. The Phantom Squadron was still on patrol, its eternal duty resonating across the decades. A silent, shimmering rebuke to an age that believed it could explain everything, yet understood so little. The circle had not closed on the mystery. It had simply drawn a new digital perimeter around the same eternal, inexplicable truth. They are always there, a silent scar on the skin of the sky, a permanent stain of memory on the vast blue canvas of the Pacific. Their war did not end with treaties or surrenders. It simply ossified. Its final, desperate moments crystallized into an eternal, repeating loop. The Phantom Squadron flies on, a procession of light and sorrow, their zeros crafted from moonlight and regret, their fuselages glowing with the cold fire of unfinished business. They are not ghosts in the traditional sense, not malevolent spirits seeking vengeance, but something far more profound and tragic. They are echoes, perfect and unchanging, reverberating through time long after the sound of their dying has faded from the ears of the living. Theirs is an endless flight, a patrol without objective or end, a celestial monument to the ultimate, searing cost of war. Their silent screams are woven into the very fabric of the wind that howls through their ethereal cockpits. Each impossible acrobatic turn is a scream. Each silent, synchronized dive is a scream. The empty, shadow-filled cockpits are a collective visual scream of absence, of lives cut short, of futures erased. They are the cost of empires and the ambitions of old men, the cost measured not in currency or territory, but in the specific, irreplaceable souls of boys like Hiroshi, like Sato's brothers, like the thousands of others whose names are forgotten, but whose final, decisive moment is forever preserved in this ghostly pantomime. Their flight is a language of loss, a silent oratory that speaks of promises unmade, of children unborn, of a quiet old age traded for a fiery instant nothing. The wind that does not stir their wings carries the weight of all that was never said, all that was never done. A mournful hymn for a price that can never be fully paid, only remembered in the shudder of a witness's soul. And memory is the key, the fragile, human thread that connects the living world to this eternal performance. It is a stubborn, tenacious force, a truth that persists with the quiet, relentless pressure of a root-cracking stone. Governments can issue denials. Experts can author dismissive reports, and the world can choose to look away, but memory endures. It lives in the weary resolve of an old man's eyes in a Kyoto tea house, in the determined scratch of a pen in a quiet Arizona study, in the guarded, fearful silence of a modern pilot staring at an impossible formation. It is a truth that does not require belief to exist. It simply is a deep, resonant chord struck in the human spirit that continues to vibrate long after the visible evidence has faded. It persists in the unspoken understanding between strangers, in the shared knowing glance that passes between those who have brushed against the mystery. It is a truth that lives in the wind, in the whispers that are not quite whispers, in the cold dread that is not quite fear, but reverence. The mystery is, and will forever remain, unsolved. No scientific instrument will ever capture its essence. No government file will ever contain its truth. No skeptic's argument will ever dismantle its reality for those who have felt its touch. It floats just beyond the reach of proof, in the liminal space between what can be measured and what can only be felt. It is a puzzle with missing pieces that were never forged in this world. A question that elicits not an answer but a profound and humbling silence. Yet, for all its elusiveness, the mystery is deeply, irrevocably felt. It is felt in the hollow ache of a veteran's heart, in the chilling certainty of a witness's gaze, in the quiet resolve of a researcher vowing to preserve a story the world does not want to hear. The Phantom Squadron's endless flight is not a problem to be solved, but a sorrow to be acknowledged, a beauty to be mourned, a truth to be carried. And so they fly on, their silent screams echoing the cost, their eternal patrol a permanent, haunting reminder that some wounds never heal. They simply become a part of the sky, forever circling in the wind, waiting for the next heart attuned to the frequency of loss to feel their passing and to understand.